You know how many airports Alaska has? Over 700. For a state with roughly 730,000 people, that works out to more airports per person than any country on Earth, more than any other American state by a margin so large it barely counts as a comparison. The United Kingdom, an entire nation of over 65 million people, operates roughly 40 airports with scheduled passenger service. Germany has just over 30. Alaska alone has more paved and gravel airstrips than most European countries combined, and it is not because Alaskans love aviation more than anyone else on the planet, although plenty of them genuinely do. It is because in most of Alaska there is no other option. No road, no highway, no way to drive to the next town over because the next town over simply is not connected to anything you can drive on. If you live in rural Alaska and you need groceries, a dentist, a delivery of home heating fuel, or a ride to see family 200 miles away, there is a real chance the only way to make that happen is to get on an airplane, sometimes one barely bigger than the family car. This is the story of why an entire American state built its everyday life around small aircraft, the way the rest of the country built its everyday life around the family sedan, and why understanding Alaska's airports means understanding something almost nobody outside the state ever fully grasps, that flying here is not a luxury, it is infrastructure. It is the mail truck, the school bus, and the grocery delivery van, all rolled into one small plane landing on a gravel bar or a frozen river. Start with the geography, because everything else about Alaska's relationship with aviation flows directly from one basic fact. Alaska is enormous, roughly 2.5 times the size of Texas, and yet it has almost no road network connecting most of its communities to anything resembling a highway grid. More than 80% of Alaska's communities, hundreds of towns and villages scattered across the state, are accessible only by air or by water. No highway connects them. No highway is even planned to connect them, because building a road across hundreds of miles of permafrost, mountains, tundra, and river deltas would cost more money than most of these communities could ever justify, even if the engineering challenges could be solved. Compare that to almost anywhere else in the United States, where even the most remote small town usually sits within an hour or two of a paved road connecting it to a larger town, then a city, then an interstate highway. That entire mental model, the assumption that everywhere is eventually reachable by car, simply does not apply across most of Alaska's landmass. This is why the airplane in rural Alaska plays a role that would be almost unrecognizable to someone living in the lower 48 states. In many villages, families do not own a car in any meaningful sense because there is nowhere to drive it, no road connecting their village to another village, sometimes not even a road connecting one side of the village to the other beyond a short stretch of gravel. What they have instead is access, direct or indirect, to a small aircraft, and that aircraft functions as the literal equivalent of a family car for an enormous range of everyday tasks that people elsewhere would never think twice about. Kids in some of these communities fly to school, either because the school itself is located in a hub community accessible only by air, or because a teacher, a specialist, or a traveling program flies in and out on a fixed schedule to serve multiple villages that could never individually support a full-time instructor. Parents fly to work, commuting by small plane, the same way someone in a city might commute by subway or by car, except the commute crosses tundra and mountain ranges rather than city blocks. Groceries, quite literally, get flown in on a weekly or sometimes daily basis, arriving in cardboard boxes stacked in the back of a small aircraft alongside mail, medical supplies, and whatever else the community ordered that week. This creates a genuinely strange economic reality that becomes obvious the moment you compare prices between Anchorage and a remote village just a few hundred miles away. In Anchorage, Alaska's largest city, Grocery prices run somewhat higher than the national average, which is already expected in a state this geographically isolated from the rest of the country. But travel out to one of the hundreds of villages accessible only by air, and prices climb dramatically further, sometimes to a degree that genuinely shocks people seeing it for the first time. A gallon of milk that might cost around $4 in Anchorage can run considerably higher once it has been flown hundreds of miles into a remote village, sometimes reaching prices that would be almost unthinkable in most parts of the country. The reason is straightforward once you understand the logistics involved. Every single item on a village grocery store shelf, from milk to bread to fresh produce to diapers, has to be flown in on a small aircraft, and every pound of cargo space on that aircraft costs real money. Fuel, pilot time, aircraft maintenance, none of it cheap in a place this remote. Add in the reality that many of these small planes are flying single-engine aircraft carrying limited payloads, meaning a single flight can only bring in so many pounds of freight at a time. And the economics of stocking a village store start to look completely different from stocking a supermarket connected to an interstate highway and a regional distribution warehouse. Heating fuel faces the exact same challenge. In villages without road access, fuel oil used to heat homes through brutally cold winters often has to be flown or barged in, and the cost of that fuel, embedded directly into the price residents pay to stay warm, reflects every mile of that difficult, expensive journey. This cost of living reality shapes daily decision-making across rural Alaska in ways that people in the lower 48 states rarely have to consider. Families plan grocery orders around flight schedules, sometimes ordering in bulk weeks in advance to make the most efficient use of limited cargo space on a scheduled flight. Fresh produce, which spoils quickly and takes up valuable cargo weight relative to its price, tends to be scarcer and considerably more expensive than shelf-stable goods, shaping diets in ways that public health researchers have studied extensively across rural Alaska. A medical emergency that would mean a short ambulance ride in most American towns can mean an air ambulance flight covering hundreds of miles to reach the nearest hospital, equipped to handle a serious injury or illness, a service that exists specifically because there is no road to drive on, no matter how urgent the need. To understand how this entire system actually functions on a daily basis, it helps to look at the aircraft themselves and the pilots who fly them, because Alaska has developed a genuinely distinct culture around small aviation that does not really exist anywhere else in the country, or arguably anywhere else on Earth at this scale. Bush pilots, as they are commonly known throughout the state, are not simply recreational flyers or hobbyists. They are, in the most practical sense, essential workers filling a role somewhere between a rural mail carrier, a delivery driver, and an emergency responder, except operating an aircraft instead of a truck. These pilots fly small, rugged planes, often equipped with oversized tires for landing on unimproved gravel bars, or fitted with skis for landing on snow and frozen rivers during the winter months, or mounted with floats that allow them to land directly on lakes and rivers during the warmer season when the ground beneath them might otherwise be nothing but soft tundra. The landing conditions Bush pilots deal with routinely would terrify a commercial airline pilot accustomed to long, smooth, well-lit paved runways with precision instrument approaches. Alaskan bush pilots land on gravel bars in the middle of rivers, narrow strips of exposed rock and sediment that shift and change with every spring flood, requiring a pilot to essentially read the terrain fresh each time rather than relying on a fixed, permanent runway. They land on glaciers, touching down on compacted snow and ice at altitude, often to drop off or pick up mountaineering expeditions, researchers, or hunting guides working in terrain that offers no other possible access point. They land on float plane docks tucked into remote coves and lake shores, threading a small aircraft down onto open water with the same casual confidence that a city driver might parallel park on a busy street. Some of the most skilled bush pilots in the state have developed a kind of folklore around their abilities. Stories passed between pilots and villagers alike about legendary landings on impossibly short gravel strips, or flights completed through weather conditions that would ground a commercial airline without a second thought. This is not reckless behavior for the sake of thrill seeking. It is a highly specialized professional skill set developed over years of experience flying the exact same routes, the exact same terrain, and the exact same unpredictable weather patterns that define aviation across the Alaskan interior and coastline. Weather itself deserves particular attention here because it shapes bush flying in ways that pilots in most of the world simply never have to contend with. Alaska's weather can shift dramatically and rapidly, fog rolling in, off the coast within minutes, sudden windstorms funneling through mountain passes, entire villages disappearing under whiteout conditions during winter storms. Bush pilots develop an intimate, almost intuitive understanding of the specific microclimates surrounding the villages and airstrips they regularly serve, knowledge that often cannot be fully captured in any official aviation weather report, because the nearest official weather station might be located 100 miles away in a completely different climate zone. Experienced pilots learn to read cloud formations, wind patterns, and subtle signs on the ground that tell them whether conditions at a specific remote airstrip are actually safe to land, even when official forecasts suggest otherwise, or vice versa. This deep, hyperlocal expertise is precisely why bush pilots in Alaska are held in such high regard within their communities, not as daredevils, but as trusted professionals whose judgment can be the difference between a routine supply run and a genuinely dangerous situation. Now step back and look at how this entire aviation-dependent system actually came to exist, because the history here diverges sharply from the story of aviation infrastructure across the rest of the United States. In the lower 48 states, the enormous nationwide network of airports traces heavily back to World War II, when the United States military rapidly built hundreds of airfields across the continental United States to train the tens of thousands of pilots needed for the war effort, then handed many of those airfields over to local governments once the war ended, under the Surplus Property Act passed by Congress in 1944. Major American airports today, including some of the busiest in the world, started their existence as wartime military airfields, essentially free infrastructure inherited by communities that never had to pay the enormous costs of original construction. Alaska's airport network grew for a fundamentally different reason. While Alaska certainly saw its own military aviation development during World War II, particularly given its strategic proximity to Japan and its role in the defense of North America, the vast majority of Alaska's more than 700 airports did not emerge from a wartime training program looking to hand off surplus infrastructure. They emerged from civilian necessity, the basic, ongoing requirement that hundreds of remote communities needed some way to receive mail, medical care, supplies, and passenger transportation, and aviation was quite simply the only realistic way to provide it. Small airstrips were carved out of tundra and forest by local communities, mining operations, missionaries, and territorial and later state government efforts specifically because the alternative, building roads across some of the most difficult and expensive terrain on the planet, was never a realistic option. This gives Alaska's aviation infrastructure a genuinely different character from the rest of the country. It was not inherited. It was built strip by strip, village by village, out of pure survival necessity. Decades of Alaskans recognizing that the airplane was the only tool capable of connecting their communities to the modern world. This distinction matters because it shapes how deeply woven aviation has become into Alaska's sense of identity and daily function, in a way that goes even further than the broader American relationship with small aircraft. Across the rest of the United States, general aviation, meaning private and small commercial aircraft outside the major commercial airline system, is a genuinely significant industry, supporting over 1 million jobs nationwide and contributing roughly $247 billion annually to the American economy, according to industry studies. Crop dusters spray millions of acres of farmland across the Midwest and South. Air ambulances connect remote communities to hospitals hours away by road. Aerial firefighting aircraft stage out of small airfields near active wildfire zones across the western states. All of this represents a real substantial industry built around small aviation. But even within that broader American context, Alaska stands apart. Because in most of the country, general aviation exists alongside a fully functional road and highway network, serving specialized needs, agricultural spraying, medical transport, recreational flying, without being the primary, everyday mode of transportation for entire communities. In Alaska, for hundreds of villages, small aviation is not a supplement to an existing transportation network. It is the transportation network, full stop. There is no highway alternative sitting quietly in the background as a backup option if the airstrip closes for weather. If the plane cannot fly, the village is, for all practical purposes, cut off from the rest of the world until conditions improve. This brings us directly to one of the most important and least understood aspects of rural Alaska's relationship with aviation: the deep connection between having scheduled air service and a community's basic sense of economic viability and future prospects. Across rural America generally, researchers have found that maintaining scheduled air service correlates with stronger economic performance in small, isolated communities, and losing that service can become one meaningful trigger contributing to broader economic decline. In much of the lower 48, this dynamic plays out through the Federal Essential Air Service Program, a subsidy system created after airline deregulation in 1978. When airlines suddenly gained the freedom to abandon unprofitable small-town routes, and hundreds of communities across the country saw scheduled flights slashed or eliminated entirely. Congress created the subsidy specifically to keep airlines flying to communities that would otherwise lose commercial air access altogether, and the federal government now spends over $500 million annually maintaining this connectivity, with spending in the most recent fiscal year reaching around $547 million. Alaska represents one of the largest and most consequential applications of this exact logic anywhere in the country, though the stakes here run considerably higher than in most other states relying on the same subsidy system. In the lower 48, losing scheduled air service to a small town is a serious economic setback, often meaning residents have to drive considerably farther to reach an airport, or lose easy access to certain business and medical opportunities that depend on air travel. In rural Alaska, losing scheduled air service to a village can mean losing the only reliable connection that community has to the outside world at all. No backup highway, no alternative route, simply isolation. Made worse during winter months, when even boat access across frozen or ice-choked waters becomes impossible. This is why in Alaska, more than almost anywhere else in the country, a community's continued access to scheduled or at least dependable charter air service functions as a genuine, tangible measure of that community's prosperity and its prospects for the future. Villages that maintain reliable air connections tend to retain population, sustain local businesses, and attract whatever limited outside investment might be available. Villages that lose that connection, whether through the collapse of a small air carrier, the loss of federal subsidy support, or simply the underlying economics of serving an extremely small, remote population becoming unsustainable, often face a much harder path toward any kind of sustained economic activity, because virtually every input a local economy needs, goods, services, workers, visitors, has to arrive by air in the first place. The economics underlying this system are genuinely difficult, and they explain why the subsidy structure supporting rural Alaskan aviation looks the way it does. Operating a small aircraft on a scheduled route to a village with a population that might number only in the dozens or low hundreds is an inherently expensive proposition relative to the number of passengers and the amount of cargo actually being moved on any given flight. Fuel has to be flown or barged in to remote refueling points at considerable added cost. Maintenance on aircraft flying constantly through harsh Alaskan weather conditions, landing on unpaved surfaces that are considerably more punishing on landing gear and airframes than smooth pavement, requires more frequent and more expensive upkeep than aircraft flying, primarily between major paved airports. Pilots require specialized training and experience specific to bush flying conditions, and that expertise commands a real market price. All of these costs get spread across a genuinely small number of passengers and a genuinely small volume of cargo on each flight. And that basic math, high fixed costs against low utilization, is precisely the kind of economic challenge that federal subsidy programs like Essential Air Service are specifically designed to address. Recognizing that pure market economics alone would likely eliminate scheduled service to many of these communities entirely if left completely to unsubsidized private airline decision-making. There is also a political dimension to why Alaska's extensive airport network persists and continues receiving substantial public investment, mirroring a pattern that plays out across small-town aviation nationwide, but taking on particular intensity in Alaska given how directly essential air access is to basic survival in so many communities. Elected officials representing Alaska in Congress have a powerful, direct incentive to fight for continued federal support of rural air service. Because unlike almost anywhere else in the country, a lapse in that support in Alaska does not simply inconvenience constituents. It can genuinely isolate entire communities from food, medical care, and basic supplies. This creates a level of political urgency around maintaining Alaska's aviation infrastructure that goes well beyond the more general nationwide argument for preserving small-town airports as an economic development tool. It becomes quite directly an argument about basic humanitarian access to food, healthcare, and connection to the rest of society for people who have chosen, for reasons rooted in culture, subsistence lifestyle, family history, or simply a preference for a way of life increasingly rare elsewhere in the country, to live in some of the most remote inhabited places on the entire planet. Consider, too, how this entire dynamic connects back to a broader pattern across the United States. The country's unusual, decades-old commitment to small aviation as a genuine transportation solution, rather than a niche hobby, a commitment that stands in sharp contrast to how other developed nations have handled connecting remote or smaller populations to their broader economies. Countries with extensive high-speed rail networks, Japan with its Shinkansen, France with its TGV, and more recently China, building the largest high-speed rail network on the planet, largely solved the challenge of connecting smaller cities and regions to major economic centers by investing heavily in fast, efficient train travel, a solution that displaced a substantial amount of what used to be short-haul domestic aviation in those countries. The United States never made that same investment, pouring its major mid-20th century infrastructure spending instead into the interstate highway system, authorized under the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, locking the country into a car and airplane-centered transportation model, just as other nations were beginning to build out competing rail networks. Alaska represents perhaps the most extreme, most consequential version of this broader American pattern, because in Alaska, unlike almost anywhere else in the country, the highway alternative that shaped transportation decisions across the lower 48 states was never even a realistic possibility for most of the state's landmass in the first place. There was no meaningful decision made at some point to skip building roads to rural Alaska in favor of building airports instead. The way there might have been an active policy choice favoring highways over rail elsewhere in the country. The terrain, the distances, the permafrost, and the sheer remoteness of hundreds of communities made road construction functionally impossible or economically absurd from the very beginning, leaving aviation as the only serious option almost by default, decades before anyone was seriously debating rail versus highway policy on a national level. This history, geography, and economics combine to produce something genuinely unique within American life. An entire state where flying small aircraft is treated with the same casual, everyday normalcy that driving a car receives everywhere else in the country. Alaskan kids growing up in villages accessible only by air often develop a familiarity with small aircraft that would seem extraordinary to a child growing up almost anywhere else. Watching planes land and take off from a gravel strip at the edge of town the way children elsewhere watch buses and cars pass by their neighborhood streets. Parents in these communities think about flight schedules, weather delays, and cargo weight limits the way parents elsewhere think about traffic patterns, gas prices, and parking availability. An entire vocabulary and set of everyday concerns exists in rural Alaska, specifically built around the realities of aviation-dependent living, concerns that simply do not register as meaningful considerations for the vast majority of Americans living somewhere with a functioning road network connecting them to the rest of the country. None of this happened according to any grand deliberate plan crafted by a government agency or a team of transportation planners sitting down decades ago and deciding Alaska should be built this way. It emerged, piece by piece, decision by decision, out of pure geographic necessity, missionaries and traders carving out the earliest airstrips because there was simply no other way to reach the communities they wanted to serve. Territorial and later state government gradually expanding and formalizing that network as Alaska grew and modernized. Federal subsidy programs stepping in decades later to keep scheduled service economically viable, once airline deregulation threatened to strip away commercial air access from smaller communities nationwide, and generations of bush pilots developing largely through hard-won experience. Rather than formal instruction, the specialized skills required to keep small aircraft safely landing on gravel bars, glaciers, and float plane docks scattered across some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet. The result is a state where the simple act of buying groceries can mean checking a flight schedule instead of checking traffic, where a child's commute to school might involve a small plane rather than a yellow bus, and where an entire community's sense of its own future can hinge on whether a single small airline decides that route remains worth flying. Alaska did not choose to become the most aviation-dependent place in America by design. It became that way because the alternative, building roads across geography that resisted roads at every turn, was never realistically available, and because generations of Alaskans, faced with that reality, simply adapted, building an entire way of life around small wings and short runways instead of waiting for a highway that was never going to arrive. If this changed the way you think about what it actually takes to live in rural Alaska, hit subscribe and let us know in the comments whether you had any idea a gallon of milk could cost this much simply because it had to be flown in, and share this with someone who has never once had to think about a flight schedule just to buy groceries.